Hey everyone, welcome to session 117 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Just a couple of quick announcements and we'll get you right to the episode. You may recall that in session 112, I chatted with Kelle Rich about, amongst other things, the upcoming Verbal Behavior Conference. In those pre-pandemic times, the event was supposed to be held in Austin, Texas. However, in anticipation of the stay-at-home orders, quarantines, and so on, Kelle wisely shifted this event to the online space. So the Verbal Behavior Conference 2020 became a virtual conference, and it went off as scheduled on April 2nd and 3rd. Now, I had the distinct pleasure of moderating the speakers panel at the end of day one, and I thought it would be fun to share it here with you. This was a fantastic group and featured all the speakers from the event, and those are Doctors Barbara Esch and her Petursdottir, Caio Miguel, Pat McGreevy, David Palmer, and Mark Sundberg. During the panel, we made some references to the speakers' earlier presentations, but don't worry, there's enough context in the discussion, so I don't think you'll have a problem understanding what we're talking about. I suppose the one exception to this is that in Dr. Esch's presentation, she talked a lot about the book Enjoy Old Age, A Practical Guide by Skinner and Vaughn. And I asked her some questions about it. So if you hear a reference, a general reference to, or generic reference to the book, that's what we're talking about. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I have a link to that in the show notes as well. I should also note that due to the video conferencing software, the audio, though listenable, is far from podcast quality. I apologize in advance for that and encourage you to give the show a listen nonetheless, as it was a fun conversation. There's a lot of exchanges, anecdotes, lessons, and so forth from all the panelists. So I hope you enjoy it. And before we get to this panel, I do want to let you know that this podcast is brought to you with support from the Essential for Living curriculum. So if you're looking for a curricular alternative for children and adults with limited repertoires, especially those without an effective, efficient method of speaking, seriously consider Essential for Living. From now until May 31st, you can use the coupon code EFL420 to receive $20 off the regular price of the EFL handbook. That's promo code EFL420, and that's $20 off for the EFL handbook. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And I think that's pretty much it for opening remarks. Oh, actually, one last thing. I just really can't emphasize how much I appreciate Kelle and the rest of her team at the Central Texas Autism Center for asking me to be a part of this fun event. So, again, a big hats off and thanks to you guys, especially transitioning this event from an in-person one to the online version of it. So, anyway, I think that's it for real this time. So without any further delay, please enjoy this fun chat with the panel from the Verbal Behavior Conference.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Wow, this is awesome. I just want to say a quick thank you to Kelle and the team at CTAC, as well as Kathleen, who's helped us produce this conference in this virtual format. It's obviously not what we intended when we all set off on this journey, but this is definitely making the best of a very challenging situation, thanks to everyone who has kind of rolled with it, as it were. So it's also a huge honor for me to have the opportunity to pick the brains of this august group. Wow, it's just such a treasure trove of information all day long. So having said that, I want to have, I'll throw questions out to specific people, but really what I prefer to do is just more so open it up to a free-for-all, if you will. So if you feel so moved as to contribute to one of your colleagues' answers, please go ahead and just jump right in. So I do want to start with my fellow New England Patriots fan, Dr. McGreevy. So the first question's for you, Pat. All right, Pat, let's see. And I got to give a hat tip to Kelly for helping me formulate this question, or for actually, I'm actually just stealing the question more precisely here. Let's see. I know you're presenting tomorrow, but can you speak to how what we've learned today towards, with regard to generative learning, bidirectional naming, et cetera, apply to the older, more impaired learner? What in the Essential for Living, for example, may touch on the development of some of those repertoires, or is it really not relevant to a learner that requires more functional skills? So what would be your, I guess, general response to all the information that we had presented today?
Well, I think in some of the information, it sort of remains to be seen how much and to what extent we can learn to apply it to learners with more limited repertoires. But some of it is just intriguing as to how we can apply it to them. And I always look forward to learning some new things because in the past many times we have assumed that learners with limited repertoires might not be able to acquire certain skills, and then we learned other ways to do things, and like, for instance, bidirectional naming, and to what extent can learners experience derived relations, and ones that don't seem to experience that very often, how could we make it so that they did? And so I always look forward to that, and so I'd love the comments of these folks. I'd love to hear their comments.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Pat, I think the point of the kind of things we used to do 30 and 40 years ago were pretty simple in the sense of nowadays. I mean, looking at basic man and basic tech, but nobody knew how to do that. Nobody believed that children could talk that couldn't talk before. And so we were with that backdrop. Now here we are 30 years later, and just looking at what everybody talked about today, we're certainly getting better and better at this higher level, more complicated kind of content, which is hard. It's taken 4 or 5 decades to develop the application of verbal behavior. And from the lights of some of the things that we're seeing, I suspect that in a few years we'll have much better teaching methodologies and ways of doing things. That is, if I were to start all over, I wish Horn and Low would have been written in 76 instead of 96. We may have been ahead of the game a little bit more, but yeah.
Very much so. Very much so.
All right. My next question is to Dr. Esch. There's two things that you touched on that I loved. The first one is, are there any other lessons? I know you couldn't spend the entire time talking about the Enjoying Old Age book that you referenced, but are there any other lessons that you had from that you'd like to elaborate on? Because to me, it seemed like a lot of those things were just kind of good for what ails you, and not, in other words, applicable to anyone at any age. So feel free to expand on that if you'd like.
My experience with the book was when John and I bought that book for both sets of our parents, and they were both very offended when we gave them the book. They were probably in their 60s at the time, I don't know. I've read the book several times, and I think, probably it's a book that you want to read in your 40s. Because some of the examples that Skinner gives really are things that you want to start in your 40s or so to get really good at something that can serve you well in retirement or in old age. I don't know, old age is kind of a weird thing. When I was 40, I sort of felt old, and then when I was 50, I didn't feel old, and now I'm 72 and I don't feel old. I don't know. I'm sure it'll come somewhere along the line. But what I do think is important is I think probably every human goes through some period in their life where they think, where they recognize that life will stop for them. And Skinner has a chapter in Enjoy Old Age on death. And it's the shortest chapter in the book. And he said he wrote it that way on purpose because it's not really something that is very productive to spend a whole lot of time thinking about. What is productive is to figure out, get your affairs in order, do what you can do with your estate planning or whatever you're going to do. But really, that's not really the thing that you want to dwell on or spend a whole lot of time on. You want to think more about what can I do before I arrived at this other country to prepare for it, like having good relationships with people. And as someone who has, I'm not seeing as many clients as I used to, and I'm doing some other kinds of things that I find interesting and enjoyable, I think it would be really a danger to arrive at this place and not have some pieces in place that sort of propel you. I was thinking about today when I was listening to Mark, and I really think all of us are kind of doing this. Dave is now doing some new things. Pat certainly is doing some very cutting edge kinds of things with the work that he's doing as a result of his book. But, to start a new analysis, maybe it's not a new analysis, but a new project like the one that Mark is embarking on is a big deal. It's a big time, takes a lot of time. You want to get it right, and people are going to benefit from it. But it's the kind of activity that he wouldn't have been able to just start last week. He's able to start it because his interverbal repertoire, as the repertoires of all of the people here on the panel, is so tight that it moves him along, and it allows him to engage in behavior. It allows everyone that I listened to today to engage in verbal behavior that moves them forward, gives them interesting things to think about, and gives all of us interesting things to think about and to mess around with.
I don't know whether you all can see this or not, but I have a copy of Enjoy Old Age on my desk. And years ago, when I first was putting together the material to write Essential for Living, Ogden was still alive. And among the many thousands of things I learned from him, he said, you could make it a shelf book or a desk book. Please make it a desk book. And Enjoy Old Age in the last 20 years for me has been a desk book. And I have used it many, many, many times. Every time I think I'm going to forget something to go somewhere the next day, I lay it against the door the night before. So I have to stumble over it to get out the door. And I learned that from this book.
I think it maybe has suffered in terms of popularity by the title. And, like he said, everybody wants to live a really long time, but nobody wants to be old. And, in our culture, at least in our society, being old is a difficulty for many people, even people that have intact skills. And it's something that, people make jokes about and everybody wants to avoid. And I know that a lot of friends of mine who color their hair are very worried about this shelter-in-place problem because they can't get to the hairdresser. What are they going to do with their roots? And
those of us who have never learned to trim our own beards have the same concern. It's probably just going to be easier to shave the doggone thing off completely.
Yes, indeed. All right, great. I also really enjoyed the anecdotes about Jim Carr and his unique motivational techniques. Could I press you for perhaps another story, if you have one that's perhaps publicly shareable? So.
A Jim Carr story?
Yeah. Just in terms of how you.
Well, I think we have a couple of other people on the panel that I'm sure I could toss that ball to.
All right. Yeah, I'll take anyone who wants to answer.
They were
just in terms of his the way, with respect to not just any story, but the way in which you described in terms of his arranging contingencies to generate desired performance.
Yeah, this may be a lead-in for Anna and Caio, but I noticed when Jim took me into the lab, or maybe someone said, at some point, Jim will call you into his office and he will have a heart-to-heart with you. And it will be a heart-to-heart that's different from the one he had with all of his other students, because he will pinpoint what you need to know. And it didn't have anything to do with book learning. It had to do with how to be the most effective person, professional that you could be. And I never had this conversation with Caio nor with Anna about what did he say to you. But I do know the lesson that I had to focus on during the whole time I was there, and it was tough, was to edit my verbal behavior. Not so much because I was complaining all the time or things like that, but because my husband once introduced me to give a talk, and I'll tell you, it was at a conference where I was following Mark Sundberg on a panel, or not a panel, but a symposium. And John was introducing me, and he said, and I was very nervous because I was not at all even sure what Mark had just said in his entire talk, much less felt like I should have been in the same symposium with him. But, and my heart was pounding. I was sure everybody could see it beating. And I was just so nervous, I really didn't think that I would be able to speak. And when John introduced me, he kind of broke the ice. He said, our next speaker is Esch, who is a former speech pathologist turned behavior analyst. And so not sure how this is going to go, because everybody knows that speech pathologist never says in 10 words something that they can say in 110 words. And so that then allowed me to breathe normally and then give my talk. But that pretty much was the premise of the advice that Jim continued to give me throughout grad school. I don't know about Anna and Caio.
Do you guys want to add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I really liked your talk, Barb. I think all of us have been influenced by a variety of folks, and it's interesting sometimes to see how that specific influence has shaped the way we behave. So I catch myself, and I'm sure Anna does too, probably saying things to students that I could hear either Jim Carr or Jack Michael say. And, it's bizarre because I don't do it on purpose, but I think that Jim had, a very structured way of supervising his students, and I think his students, all of whom became quite successful in the field. And I think a lot of it had to do with how he actually structured the way that he, ran his lab, and I think the expectations, as you mentioned. And I remember feeling very proud to be part of his lab and really not wanting to disappoint. And I think recently I saw this again. My wife was much later one of Jim's, she was his last PhD student, so they had meetings. And I remember hearing him tell her the same thing that he would tell us. Like, well, you can pick the deadline that you want, but once you set it, you must meet it. And so you do have this sort of a fear of disappointment. And it reminds me a little bit of Dick Malott, that tells you how sometimes aversive control is your friend. And it's certainly, it's something that controls a lot of my students' behaviors. Because I don't have a lot of control over their positive reinforcers, but I have a lot of control over their negative reinforcers. So sometimes, that's what gets us out of bed. But Jim has always been very subtle about this. And I think the fear of disappointment has always been something that still guides me to this day, right? When he comes see one of my talks, like all I'm thinking about is, what is he going to think about it? And I think it's the same for other folks that have influenced us. I think, here I have Dave and Mark and Pat and Barb and Anna, who worked, who studied with me, Barb and Anna. And I think you always have this sort of I don't think it's fear, but you definitely care about their perspective. And that, I think, it's a big motivating operation, too, to do a good job.
Yeah,
I think it's nice to have role models. Yeah.
And I will say, to this date, every time that I find myself in a how should I put it, a difficult situation involving a student where I have to have a difficult conversation with a student, my first thought is always, and I don't know what to say, I don't know how to handle it. My first thought is always, how would Jim handle this? What would Jim say? And I literally try to visualize Jim Carr speaking to that student. And I don't know if I necessarily come up with what he would actually say, but I feel like it helps me be confident that I can do this.
Excellent.
And then every time I think, what would Jack Michael say, then I don't say it.
maybe we'll leave the details there and just leave that one there. I don't know. All right. So, all right, Dr. Miguel and others, I want everyone's opinion on this, or should you have a similar one or an opposing one for that matter. We've got many people wanting to know, why is receptive labeling such a horrible term? You referenced the paper in which you described that, but just for folks who did not catch that, tell us all the problems with that term. What would you like us to do differently?
Murray Sigmund talked a little bit about this in his 1994 book when he talks about one of the outcomes of, when you're teaching the matching, the auditory visual matching to samples. So if you think about what people refer to as receptive labeling, they're really describing, behaviorally, they're describing an arrangement, usually that involves an auditory stimulus, and then you have an array of objects or things that individuals have to select. So conceptually, you have an auditory visual matching to sample, or conditional discrimination. And in a conditional discrimination, again, you have an auditory stimulus that serves as a contextual stimulus, or the conditional stimulus that changes the evocative value of one of the comparisons, which would be something you're selecting. Now, the terms receptive and expressive, they assume the sort of central agency. So then language is no longer behavior, but what you're doing when you're talking or when you are pointing to something, you are, you're either expressing an idea, or you are receiving and then decoding information from someone else. Now, when you're talking about expressing and receiving, then your behavior now becomes secondary. It's just sort of a vessel that is carrying this idea that lives in the central agency. So you're essentially just assuming that language is this sort of abstract thing that lives somewhere, and your behavior is a way to express it or receive the information. And I think that what follows is, if you're using terms like receptive and expressive, and it leads to this assumption, and if you think the language is something that lives within a central agency, whatever that is, then you should be your subject matter is no longer behavior. Your subject matter are those verbal ideas, or this sort of immaterial process. So it's very conceptually and systematic with the field of behavior analysis, which very early decided to get rid of those intervening variables to address the real causes of behavior. Because remember, for Skinner, it wasn't a matter of caring about, like we shouldn't talk about covert things or things that occur within the skin, is that we shouldn't really consider those intervening variables that would just get away or lead us to not really assess the real variables that might be controlling behavior. So, if you think about something as simple as, and I see this problem all the time, you deprive a rat of water or food for a long time, and then you ask the student, why is it that the rat pressed the lever more often? And the student is going to say, well, because the rat was hungry. Well, you see that that's a problem, because that leads to this sort of circular reasoning that Skinner was worried about. Like, well, how do you know the rat's hungry? Well, because it's pressing the lever a lot. And why is he pressing the lever a lot? Because it's hungry. But you know that what has led the animal to press the lever was the fact that you have deprived the animal of food for 24 hours or so. So why is it using the term hunger? How does that add to the analysis? And that's kind of why we got rid of it. We just say, well, you deprive the rat, and there's a direct functional relation between lever presses and food deprivation. Like, does the rat feel hungry? Sure. But, if the rat could tell you something, the rat would say, I'm experiencing some feelings here that that you can teach the rat to say that those feelings that he or she experiences called hunger. But that's just the tact of a private event. It's not really making the rat press the lever. So I think the terms receptive and expressive are problematic in a sense that they're not conceptually systematic with behavior analysis. Now, some people, and I argue with some people about this, and I love to hear what other people have to say, but some people argue and say, well, but the terms receptive and expressive are easier for people to understand, right? Instead of, for example, using the term listener for receptive and maybe speaker for expressive, people would say, well, receptive and expressive are easier, right? And if you're dealing with schools and you're dealing with teachers and you're dealing with parents, and I'm like, okay, that makes sense, but you're using technical terms like reinforcement. You're using technical terms like discriminative stimuli. You're using technical terms like, rules and whatnot. So why is it that we use some technical terms but not others? Like, so if you're going to be consistent and use terms, then use all of them. But if you want to just be, use more popular language so people can understand you, then we should then use receptive, expressive, rewards, and cues, and so forth. So I think there's some sort of inconsistency, and it worries me when people use this terminology that they might be thinking that actually language is a thing, and it's just not behavior. So that's my take on it. You see, I'm very passionate about it.
Yes, I think we probably have some other passionate panelists here. So I see Mark's hand is raised. Mark, take it away, sir.
Well, this kind of stuff is fun. Just following up on one of the points that Caio made, and that is that it's often viewed, expressive and receptive, as just different manifestations of the same underlying cognitive process. And that's the real meat that everybody's after, is the same cognitive process. But as we know, those repertoires are very different. And by talking about expressive language and receptive language, it suggests that they're equal in some way. And at least when I first started working with nonverbal kids back in the early 70s, it was accepted to just teach receptive language for a non-vocal child, because after all, it was half a language. And if they could at least understand the meanings of words and so on, that these meanings, and so you get caught up in meaning and cognitive constructs and so on. And the general notion that expressive behavior and receptive behavior, when you come down to doing the analysis of what constitutes it, they're very separate preterm contingencies. The stimulus may be the response for a receptive one, and it's the antecedent maybe for an expressive, and vice versa. The fact that you have one repertoire doesn't ensure the other. So as Caio was pointing out, the conceptual inconsistency between those two large repertoires, the listener repertoire is far more than receptive discrimination. So when people talk about receptive language, they often are just talking about visual, verbal, auditory, visual conditional discrimination, not the wealth of the listener repertoire that Dave was talking about. And when you look at receptive language, all that fits in there too. Every topic that Dave raised, we could put in that category, but that's not in the standard categories that, you know, Barb and all of us kind of grew up with in the speech pathology or applied language area. Was the framework all assessments were in and everything else, which, by the way, Barb, I got to thank you and Kate Lalonde and for your review of all of those assessments and pointing out that receptive expressive distinction really doesn't take you very far when you really are trying to figure out what's going on with a nonverbal child.
So
yeah, and I think, go ahead, Anna.
So yeah, I'm going to say I have a little bit of a different take on this. I completely agree that terms receptive and expressive, if you think about where they come from, if you think about their origin and the kind of idea behind these terms, that's highly problematic. I don't think when people use these terms today, and I know these terms, they're still used widely. They're used in special education. They're used in speech language pathology. These are terms that were used in extensively within applied behavior analysis. I would say maybe 20, 30 years ago, they were used in the UCLA curriculum. They spread and came to be used very, very widely. And I think most of the time when people use these terms, they aren't making those assumptions about, mental events or ideas that are being transferred between persons. I think they're just using these terms essentially operationally to describe the same thing essentially in a less technical manner that we are talking about when we say auditory visual conditional discrimination, which is a highly technical term that I really don't want to use when I'm talking to anyone except for behavior analysts. And I don't want only behavior analysts to contact my verbal behavior, so I don't see a problem with sticking like receptive in the title of an article if that makes it easier for people to find, even though I also may use technical terms within that same article. I think that is helpful. I think if we insist, if we are too strong in our insistence and always using our technical terms, then we are alienating an audience that could potentially benefit from contact with our science and our practice. So that is my take on that. I will tell you what some of the early behavior analytic work on speaker and listener behaviors actually uses terms that I find much more problematic. So for example, the early articles by Don Baer and colleagues, and I'm not blaming them. This is just, this was verbal behavior that was reinforced in their community, right? So they called it comprehension and production. So listener behavior was comprehension, speaker behavior was production. Those terms, I think, are even worse than receptive and expressive. Like, for example, why is listener behavior more about comprehension than speaker behavior, and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think obviously these aren't good technical terms, but I don't think mostly when people use them, they are making those assumptions that seem to kind of that were, I guess, being made when those terms first came to be used.
Maybe.
I know
think that, Anna is making an interesting point that I just wanted to, sorry, Pat. I think that there's an issue in the field, too, that we see a lot of different procedures being called different things, right? And I think sometimes that's a problem in terms of communicating within, not only within scientists, but also with, I think, the consumers. I was reviewing a paper this morning in which the authors conduct a study in this thing that I'm not going to say what it is because I don't want to review who the authors are, but they call this phenomenon as one thing, and they review the literature, but the same phenomenon is also has a different name, and in another group of researchers have conducted a vast amount of studies under this different name that I think the authors were never able to contact it. So essentially we had to reject the paper and say you need to go back and read all this other literature. So I think one of the issues too is I think there is some inconsistency in how people talk about those things. Anna might be right that some people are using receptive and expressive without making assumptions about central agencies, but other people are not. And I think young behavior analysts may still not have a very good grasp of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. And sometimes I worry about the way we label things because it might make you think differently. So I think that what I'm trying to say is mostly it would be nice if we all in the field were consistent with how we use terminology. But I think that's it could be a whole topic for a podcast, Matt, just talking about consistency in terminology, right?
All right, I'm down for that. Pat, you wanted to get on this, didn't you?
Well, just a brief comment. When we decided to, in our curriculum, to try and make things as plain in the language as we could, keeping in mind Skinner's warning that words sometimes that appear to be plain also carry their own baggage and their difficult histories, but we tried to do it. We stayed away from receptive and expressive completely because it carried so many different connotations to so many different people that would be reading it. And then when I remember we came to the notion of when you're trying to, I remember I approached Jack with this thought, and I said, when somebody sees text and they learn to respond to the text, but they can't read it, so they've never learned to read it as a signer or as a vocal individual, they don't learn to read the text, what we would call read the text. But yet they learn how to respond to what the text is telling them to do, like even the labels on a restroom door, men and women, okay? And I said to Jack, I said, well, if a person can respond to the text without reading it, what do you call that? And like he used to always do with me, he said, you know that, you know the answer to that. And I could say, well, I don't think. And then I think for an hour or two, I'd come back later, I'd see him, we'd be at a conference, I'd say, oh, I haven't come up with it, Jack, I don't know. And then he would say, what does Skinner call that? And again, I hadn't remembered. And he said, Skinner called that responding to text as a listener, as if the text were speaking to you, responding to the text. And so we decided that at Center for Living, that's what we would call it, because many of our individuals can learn to respond to text without ever having the reading, but they're responding as a listener. But it's very functional.
All right, very good. I had a question about the going to the store on the way home, the slide that you mentioned, Dr. Miguel. I thought that was funny, and it made me reminiscent of those times when those activities were freely available. But that aside for a moment. So it got me thinking, like, so you went through, and that, David, I've heard you talk about this as well, you know, in terms of the kind of the rehearsal that you go through to kind of keep that list of stuff in your head, or perhaps to write it down or whatever so you don't forget anything. I would love to get everyone's take on what is happening conceptually as, let's say, for example, okay, that becomes the stuff that I get. I stop at the store every Thursday on the way home from work, and I get pretty much the same thing. Right. I think most people go grocery shopping, you know, if they go on any sort of regular interval. You know, I mean, I have a family of 5, so we're always making lists because there's always, you know, little things that we need. But, you know, there's a lot of commonality on those things. A lot of things we actually don't even put on the list because it's just stuff we get when we're at the store. But it took some time to for that repertoire to develop. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, what do you folks think is going on as one starts from a place of having to write everything down and then moving towards a place where those things are just kind of automatically known? And again, I'm using language that's, violates all sorts of, concepts and principles here. I'm speaking loosely, of course.
Yeah, and I'll give you.
I'm hoping you guys will clean it up. So there'll be some learning
I'll
curve,
give
right?
an
That'll be
example.
involved.
Yeah, I'll give an example of a study we've done, and I think I'd love to hear what Dave wants to say about this. But in some of the studies we've done, we've actually taught participants some very complicated sort of mediation. So, and Anna has done some of those studies too. She might talk about them tomorrow, where you may teach participants to engage in a series of interverbals to sort of solve a task, right? So initially, you may do a matching to sample. A lot of the studies use matching to sample. So you may have a picture of a bird, maybe it's a robin, and then you teach the participants to say the robin goes with, the redwoods, and the redwoods goes with the turtle, and the turtle goes with something else. And then initially, when you present the redwood and the something else, right, the last sort of picture they saw in that chain, the participants in the first few trials, they have to engage in all this covert or sometimes overt, right? I mean, usually overt behavior where they say, okay, this is the robin and it goes with this and it goes with this. That's why I need to pick this one. And we measure, not only we do protocol analysis, we measure to see what the participants are saying during those trials. We ask them to talk out loud, but we also take data on latency. And what we see is that regardless of the arrangement of trials, the first few trials are usually much longer in latency than they are later. And I think the assumption is that, after a few trials, they no longer need to engage in this sort of verbal mediation, right? So they just see the sample, and that is a conditional stimulus for them to select whatever else is in that large stimulus class. So I think if you're going to the store, and I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think if you're going to the store all the time and picking some of those items, I think that there might be very little mediation that might be occurring at that time. I certainly know exactly where certain things are in my grocery store, so I don't think there's very little mediation going on. I mean, just a very simple, listener response. So I think that maybe in the initial stages of the problem solving, but after a while, if you practice that behavior too many times, then I think you have a bunch of contextual cues that acquire discriminative control over your behavior.
So I'm thinking, from what I'm understanding, it's not a smooth gradient from disfluent to fluent performance. You get it pretty quickly, and then you're on autopilot. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. At least that's what we saw in our studies, but our tests maybe are not complex enough in some of our studies. But yeah, it is usually like the first two trials, you need some mediation, but then they become quite fluent. And I think
David, do you have any thoughts on that? I know you've done a lot of stuff on like the behavioral analysis of memory, and I think we talked about that when you were on the podcast earlier, and it kind of also made me think of that question in light of our discussion several months ago.
Oh, you're mute.
Am I the only one who can't hear him?
Yeah, no one can.
No.
Yeah.
Can't hear him.
David, if just on your local phone, if you'll just press unmute on your cell phone.
I pressed mute, but
we got you.
It's working.
Hey,
gotcha.
Okay, but I can still hear everyone else.
Oh, I see. Yeah. If you'll mute your computer speakers, that will take care of that.
Mute my computer speakers. Okay. All right. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay, great. All right. Returning to the question of what is it that controls our behavior when we go to the store and buy something, unless we have a list in front of our noggin where we're reading off the items. And I don't know the answer to this, but suppose we had 100 items we wanted to buy. I can't think of any way in which the kinds of strategies that we've been talking about could do the job. Using an extreme example like that kind of focuses us on how do we do it when we only have a few things? Well, we think about things, and as we think about things, there's our behavior's been continually conditioned as we do stuff, as evidenced by the fact that we can describe what we've done, 5 hours later. So if we were not continually being conditioned, I don't see any way in which we could describe our past behavior that way. So I'm suggesting that when you read the item, pick up wine, and let's see, Caio had wine and chocolate and cheese and croissants. There's something else in the lower left corner. But you see, lower left corner, to me, I'm visualizing Caio's diagram of the things he wanted to buy. And conditioning occurred at that time. And now I'm at the grocery store. I can look around Caio's clock of items. The first thing was wine. That was very strong in its repertoire. And I imagine Danielle
well
represented. Did not forget the wine, and how enthusiastically Caio would go and fulfill that demand. And so there was a little story I was telling about Caio and his grocery list. So there was conditioning going on. And now that I'm at the store, I go back. I try to tap into that conditioning. And one of the ways of doing that is simply to walk around the store, and bingo, you see the wine aisle, and you say, oh, yeah, that's what I wanted to get. And that's an example of joint control. But so I think there's something sort of special about a small, manageable list of things. I don't know how big a dozen maybe. But once we get above that, there's a lot of competition, and I don't know really how to say this in behavioral terms, but I think it becomes harder and harder without mnemonic strategies. That is, if you had 100 things, you would have, and you didn't have a list, you would engage in a complex kind of mnemonic strategies. So you'd say, you'd use the method of loci or some other crazy mnemonic strategy for
the memory power.
But your question taps into all of this wealth of complex stuff where someone tells you to do something, and then later on you're able to behave as if the person were right there telling you. And that's a deep well of mystery. But I think we have to look at the conditioning of the behavior of the individual at the time of what I used to call or what I still call an acquisition strategy. That is, when you're trying to remember a list, conditioning is occurring. And so we have to tap into that conditioning that's occurring at the time we make the list, at the time we want to retrieve the list at a later time. As long as I have the microphone and have an opportunity, I've been silent because I couldn't figure out this damn phone thing. I wanted to say that I have a copy of Enjoy Old Age that I've been reading because Barb and I are the same age, and she doesn't feel old, but I do. And so I turned to Skinner for solutions. Second, I want to say that Barb adjured us not to engage in a bunch of negative descriptors, and every single day I spend most of my day saying liar, fake, cheater. So I gotta take a lesson from Barb about how to manage my behavior in this very unusual time.
Oh, challenging.
Oh.
Yeah, if anybody can figure it out, you can.
Oh, thank you.
All right. I have another question here submitted by Lori. Lori, I'm going to paraphrase your question here. She had some questions regarding Dr. Petursdottir's studies on echoic. Oh, wait. It's, where is it? It wasn't that one. Hold on real quick. This is going to make great radio here. There was a question about the publishing of what I guess would be called like the null result, I think in your presentation. And I want to just talk about that more broadly and open it up to our folks who are more spend most of their time in the academy here, and just talk about the general notion of publishing negative findings. So I guess I have a general question about the importance of doing that.
Yeah.
Should it be done more often? I have a lot of folks I know who are, assistant professors who want to be associate professors and full professors someday. So I don't think publishing null results is probably the path to the tenure, but I could, I'm not an academic, so maybe there's stuff I'm missing. But I'd like to just kind of open it up in our closing minutes to kind of riff on this for a few minutes. So.
Yeah, I definitely have an opinion on that. So yeah,
please share.
Everybody hates to get null results, and null results are harder to publish, and they're kind of viewed with suspicion if you're getting negative results over and over and over again. It's generally not something any of us want for our lab students. At the same time, I think it is extremely important to publish negative results, not maybe just any negative results, because there could be a lot of reasons why you don't find an effect of an independent variable. And some of these reasons just have to do with problems with your study. So I don't think necessarily every negative result is worth publishing, but it's worth following up on. So why do you think, if, what are some possible reasons why you got that null result? Follow up on it. Try to see if you can get the effect this other way and this other way and this other way. Ultimately, if you don't get it, and the fact that you don't get it is something that actually matters, theoretically or practically, then I think absolutely that should be published. And that's kind of, obviously with, our research on the echoic, we kind of went back and forth, like, should we publish this? At what point should we publish it? We ended up collecting a lot of data that we didn't publish because it was all negative findings. But, we have published, I guess, one of these studies that was entirely negative findings, but we did have two experiments where the second addressed some of the issues with the first. And we actually have, and we've included some of the negative findings in another publication. And we do have two that we're trying to move through the pipelines right now. How that's ultimately going to go, I guess we'll just have to see. But, I think it's obviously important. You have to follow up on negative findings. You have to, kind of try to examine, try to, poke at it, figure out what is there. Could it just be that you did it wrong? You didn't do it right.
What are the things that have to go right for a negative study to be published? Meaning, I'm thinking just off the top of my head, and again, I don't engage in any research professionally, So, but I'm thinking that there are basics that probably have to be met, like your experimental design has to be solid, your et cetera, et cetera. So, in addition, I know I see people dying to chime in, so I'll just stop talking. So,
okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. I think Anna's experiments are extremely important because they show that they force us to look not at echoic behavior, but earlier in the receptive language, if you will, sequence. As I said in my talk, it's not the echoic so much as the behavior at the moment the speaker is speaking. At least that's the direction I'm forced, and I'm forced in that direction because I have great faith that Anna's right. That it's her. And it's surprising. I was as surprised as she was. I attended her talk at ABBA last year, so I was aware of the general thrust of her work. But I think the answer lies, and if she didn't publish it, people wouldn't realize the importance of focusing on different variables. Now, for For example, I would suggest that we could look at the effect of words that can be echoed because the child has an echoic repertoire, and words that can't be echoed because the child doesn't have that particular repertoire. Anyone who doesn't believe that you can echo anything should go to YouTube and Google Kosa, K-H-O-S-A, the Kosa language, K-H-O-S-A, and look for some examples of the Kosa language. It's the Bantu click languages, and they are inconceivably difficult to echo if you haven't been raised, or I don't know, maybe there's some mimic who can do it, but I can't even imagine how people could echo that. So twiddling around with the ease with which people can follow along at the moment of speech, distinguishing between things that can be echoed, things that can't, is a possible next step for Anna's work. But I would say if that's so important to publish that stuff for this
And
reason.
I wish I had said this when I saw your talk, Dave, because I definitely think that, just because we are not finding this particular effect in our studies, I don't think that means the echoic is irrelevant, because I think, as you pointed out in your talk, it's clearly a prerequisite for task to be able to emerge. You're never going to see the emergence of a task if the response form, a vocal task is the response form, is something you cannot echo at all. And there is actually a study that came out in CABB, I think it was last year, by Kelle and Greer, so it was out of Doug Greer's lab, that demonstrated this nicely, because they were teaching Chinese words, as I recall, to I think it was young children of typical development, and so they found that basically, now of course I don't remember all the details of this study, but it was along the line that they didn't test for bidirectional naming in Chinese initially, but after they were taught to echo Chinese speech sounds in general, not necessarily the specific sounds that they were then exposed to, and that were then paired with, nonverbal stimuli. Once they had learned, once they had acquired that Chinese echoic repertoire, they saw those behaviors, and it was in particular emergent taxing that was missing before, and now was observed after echoic instruction.
Yeah, I think I would even argue a little bit with the term negative findings. The findings are findings, and those findings that are done, properly and well, and with threats to internal validity considered and all that sort of thing, they should be published. And then right alongside of that, we've been given lip service in our field for years for publishing replications, and yet we hardly ever do it. And we insist that in many cases that a PhD thesis can't be a replication. I mean, that's how things stay in the body of science. And so, no, I just, findings are findings. They should be publishable.
And yeah, I definitely agree with you also on replications. I think we need to do more of both of these things. We need to publish more replications, which I'm really glad Java now has that entire replication section. I think that is wonderful. And yeah, I do think we also need to, when it is appropriate to do so, to publish negative findings. And I don't think they're always interesting. The fact that maybe like a particular intervention didn't work for, if you have an N of 1 study and a particular intervention did not result in reduction in problem behavior, probably before you publish that, you want to follow up on that and try to figure out, okay, could it be that, there was something wrong with the way you were doing it? Were you assuming an incorrect function of the behavior, so on and so forth. So, I mean, I don't think just anything is worth publishing that is a null finding, but yeah, I think we need to absolutely be more open to publishing these.
Very good. Awesome. We have about 120 seconds left. So I will end with this question. We've got probably about a dozen variations of the same question. Mark Sundberg, when is the generative assessment available?
Give me a year. Well, I was figuring at least a year before the virus hit, and things have gotten complicated, so we'll have to see. But I'll still be on about a 1-year track, I hope.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. I think that's it for the time we have allotted to this. So thank you for fielding these questions and chiming in, and more generally just having a fun conversation. And again, I want to thank our host, the Central Texas Autism Center, Kelly, and the rest of the team.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.